Peace, Barricade.
Hello and welcome on the Peace Barricade. My name is Maria Cernata. I'm your host and I'm an academic based in Bucharest, and it is with great pleasure that I invite to our cameras and microphones David Swanson, author, journalist, long-standing peace activist, and executive director of World Beyond War, also radio host. I will put the links in the description of this particular episode. Very interesting things are happening in the United States, isn't it? And especially from the point of view of the peace activists. You have Donald Trump, let's call it one of the most controversial presidents that you ever had, advocating for peace in Ukraine. How to interpret that? I mean, I'm speechless.
Well, it's very draining and confusing and bewildering and exhausting and wasteful of efforts because the White House will put out one story in the morning and a completely different one in the afternoon, and the activist groups will be drafting their statements and petitions and making plans for lobby visits and rallies, and then the whole thing gets flipped upside down 8 hours later. I think part of what's needed is to invest less of our energy into trying to interpret and analyze the logorrhea coming out of the mouth of this fascist jackass who's apparently not accountable to any of us or the rule of law, and instead pay very close attention to what he does and what we can do about what he does, right? So within the past few days, they announced through the Secretary of War at the Pentagon 8% cuts in military spending every year for the next 5 years. And within several hours, they had explained, well, it's not actually cuts, it's cutting some things and investing in other things. It's just moving the money around to stupider, crazier stuff like an Iron Dome that won't work. And meanwhile, Trump is making statements about let's cut military spending in half. Let's get Russia and China too. Let's abolish nuclear weapons. And peace activists, which you can understand their frustration and desperation, are, just fainting with delight. And the stock market's crashing, the weapons prices are plummeting, the Congress members are freaking out, the Democrats who want to pretend they're against military spending but they're not are just falling all over themselves, and meanwhile they're pushing through Congress legislation endorsed by Donald Trump to massively increase military spending, including for nuclear weapons. So I think part of what we have to do is watch the magician's other hand, right? You got the scantily clad assistant over here, let's get rid of nukes. And you got the hand under the table, let's pass legislation to defund everything that's left of good and decent public projects and move it into the Pentagon. When it comes to particular wars like Gaza and like Ukraine, again, you got to pay less attention to the garbage coming out of the guy's mouth. He has no plan or ability to turn Gaza into a real estate deal and a luxury resort. There's no obvious way that's going to happen other than killing everybody. And if he's going to kill everybody, he's going to do it with weapons. We got to stop the weapons, what we've been trying to do for the past 3 years and 3 decades. He's got no ability to make Canada a state. These are just distractions. Ukraine is a little more complicated because just him talking, even useless, hopeless, blithering idiocy, is better than the previous guy who refused to talk at all. Like, we'll pretend the Russians don't exist. We won't talk with them, right? The Russian ambassador left because no one would talk to him. So just talking, like we've been demanding that for years, and Trump's doing it. He's doing it in a way that's pretty unlikely to result in stable, lasting peace or justice. The divisions within Ukraine, politically and geographically, are not being addressed as far as one can see. And it's not clear that he's going to stop sending the weapons to Ukraine. And so, our fundamental demand when Biden was on the throne was talk is cheap as long as you keep sending the weapons, both to Israel and Ukraine. I think this is our central critique now. Talk is cheap as long as you keep sending the weapons. But negotiation is good. That's a good thing to talk about doing negotiations. But you got to do them with the concerns of all the people in all the regions. All the players have to have a seat at the table and an eye toward lasting peace, not just enrichment of some mineral company. Has to be central. So it's not as complicated as we try to make it. We don't have to understand every incoherent sentence that this guy puts on social media. We have to understand that without the weapons, they can't kill as many people. So we got to stop the weapons.
Definitely. Now, first question, we have to address the other part, and we have to also criticize the ones that are closer to us, the liberal elites, the progressive elites. Sometimes they behave irresponsibly, and they behave like children. Oh, we don't like this guy. Even he advances peace, we reject it. We reject peace altogether because we don't like the guy. We hate him because he's horrible. So we reject everything that he says, even though we know even a broken clock is right twice a day. But we reject everything. And I think this is also very detrimental.
Well, it's idiocy, it's childishness, it's an excuse for positions that are actually driven by corruption and other disreputable interests. But we saw this with Russiagate. We're going to pretend that Trump works for Russia, therefore we must all hate Russia. We saw this with NATO. We're going to pretend Trump wants to get rid of NATO. We must swear our eternal loyalty and devotion to NATO. We're going to pretend that Trump wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. I say pretend because one sentence out of this guy's mouth that contradicts everything else he says and does is an excuse to think something. It's not a basis to think something. And so we're going to pretend he wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. All of a sudden, the progressive Democrats are for nuclear weapons. This is just stupidity. And it's particularly stupid because if you want to oppose Trump and you want to talk about the glory of the Democratic Party, you can pick which Trump to oppose. You can oppose the Trump who's putting new nuclear weapons into Europe. You can oppose the Trump who's demanding 5% of everybody's GDP go into mass murder. You can oppose the Trump who's pushing this legislation through Congress, who's endorsing a House bill to destroy the world, to defund everything that's good and decent and law-abiding in the U.S. government and put everything into mass killing and destruction. You could oppose that Trump. And if you don't want to celebrate the other Trump, the Trump that said some things on a couple of Zoom calls and social media posts, okay, don't do it. But pick. You can pick. It's like I'm against the Bible. Well, you can find everything and its opposite in the Bible. So pick which thing to oppose, and you're for the other thing. You can find everything under the sun and its opposite in Trump. So, opposing something because Trump said it is doubly idiotic because he also said its opposite. So at some point you have to come up with your own positions that aren't based on, which sadistic bumbling idiot on the throne of the kingdom of Washington, D.C. said it,
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And let me tell you that this reflects this attitude of some Democrats in the United States reflects very well, unfortunately, in the European states. that just now that J.D. Vance gave that talk that left some people in tears, I found that to be unbelievable in the Munich Security Council. They now say, oh, we want the Ukraine war to continue because we want to oppose Trump. Now, this is idiotic from the points of view that you express, but also from the point of view, okay, you said Russia is a danger. That you said we want to oppose Russia. How are you going to oppose Russia without the United States? Also from this pro-war point of view, it's pure lunacy. How do you find the reactions of the European leaders? Because for me, it's bewildering. I mean, I don't know what to make of it.
It's comical. It's not universal. There are good people in European governments, probably more than in the US government. There's a decent, halfway good political party in Germany. But I read a column, I think, yesterday from the UK, from The Guardian, suggesting that German politicians who aren't telling the German public before the election that they want to take every last dime of their money and put it into war are lying to them, and they should be responsible and honest and tell the people what's going to be needed. But this is a guy from England telling Germany that it's going to have to, this is like NATO that's now going around openly telling the European Parliament that governments must defund healthcare and retirement and put it into war. This is evil. And Zelensky telling the world that if the United States does not destroy Russia, Russia is going to attack all of Europe. If you make peace with Russia in a way that moves toward greater peace and disarmament, then Russia is not going to attack Europe. If you continue to make war between the West and Russia, then you're increasing the chances of Russia attacking the West. So Zelensky, whether he believes what he says or not, has it, exactly upside down. And for Trump to, Trump is not the one who's going to die if you continue the war because you hate Trump, right? The people of Ukraine and Russia and all of us, if it becomes a nuclear war, all of us, including Trump, that's the only way you destroy Trump in your beloved war, is by destroying all life on Earth through a nuclear war, a nuclear winter. Otherwise, Trump is going golfing every single day while people in Ukraine are being slaughtered and starved and bombed, and Russian troops the same for your war. That, according to polling that seems believable in Ukraine, despite the intense suppression of free speech in Ukraine, the majority of people in Ukraine want the negotiations with everything on the table. The president, in the name of democracy, who bans political parties and elections and free speech and conscientious objection, wants to refuse negotiations. And so, he says he wants a seat at the table when he's, up until this minute, wanted there to be no table. And I think, Trump is a bit of a simplistic idiot. He doesn't speak very clearly or subtly. He decides which side is the angel and which side is the dictator, just like almost every person on Earth, which is probably why many persons on Earth can relate to him. But his critique of Zelensky is at least partially right.
Unfortunately, yes, I couldn't agree more. Because Zelensky wants a seat at the table, but at the same time, his peace proposals are just pure fantasies. The Russians are never going to accept something like that. But, I think Trump doesn't want necessarily peace, but I think he wants the United States out of this. He doesn't want to owe this war And I think it's a clever move on his part in the sense that he wants to say, okay, Europeans, you want to go ahead with the war, fantastic. We gave you tons of money. We did a lot of things for you. Now it's time for us to get out. And then you solve the problem with Russia and Zelensky.
Yeah, I don't think he cares much about human life unless he cares about a particular type of human life that he's defined as white, because he does talk frequently about his concern for human life in Ukraine in a way that just doesn't happen when he talks about any other part of the world, even the United States. But I think in general, his concern is about money. I mean, he overlaps with this bizarre political creature we have in the United States called the libertarian, who opposes spending money. Opposes spending money on healthcare, retirement, schools, parks, transportation, wars, like everything, including wars. And so the peace activists agree with them on wars, and so there's a little bit of this, at least in the nonsense that the guy says. Again, in what he does, he's pushing for dramatically increased military spending, and I think you have to look more to the business profits and the corruption than to balancing of the budget. That is, the United States and NATO have always wanted the European countries to spend more on US made weapons. And in some cases, it's not quite working out because the Europeans are agreeing to spend more on weapons, but on European weapons. No, they got it wrong. Like that wasn't the plan. I think, in his first term in office, Trump openly bragged about his successes in selling US weapons to the world. This was new. Like, a major part of every US president's job for decades has been selling weapons to the world. The State Department, this is a big chunk of what the State Department does, right? But Trump was the first, at least in a long time, to hold big press conferences with posters and brag about how many weapons he was selling for how many dollars, when it wasn't for the US government, it was for his friends at some weapons company, right? And I think that too is part of it. He wants to make the Europeans pay money, and he wants to make them pay money into the weapons dealers, and he wants them to take the money out of horrible leftist commie pinko things like healthcare and schools and retirement
Yeah, those things that are, such a burden on the budget. When spending it on weapons, it's such, a relief on the budget. I totally get it. Now, there are commentators suggesting that this is the end of NATO, and probably Donald Trump wants to disengage and wants the NATO troops out of Europe because he simply doesn't care and he wants to focus on other parts of the world, and especially in Romania, because for so long we've been trained to fear the Russians. Now this is creating hysterical, reactions among the intellectuals. Everybody's weeping. Everybody's crying. Trump is going to betray us. We are going to enter once again into the sphere of interest of Russia. What are we going to do? Is this choir of people crying and decrying the near future abandonment of Romania by the US. Do you think that's plausible? Since you said that it would be way more profitable to stay here and make us pay a lot of money for US weapons.
I think it's entirely possible that Russia will try to attack various countries, including Romania. The Russian government is as evil as anything on earth. But the way to make that more likely is to continue down the path and to ignore the history lessons that were known beforehand. Like, if you do these things, you're going to provoke Russia, you're going to get a war. And they do them, and they provoke Russia, and they get a war, and they pretend it never happened, and that Russia acted out of zero provocation, the unprovoked war. And then you have NATO leaders right now at this moment promising you that if you keep boosting NATO within the next 5 years, you're going to get a war with Russia across the world, World War III. This is what NATO itself says you're going to get, right? And the people who say that it was insisting on NATO membership that got this war going in Ukraine include the Secretary General of NATO, the previous one who just left the job, right? So if you want to decrease the chances of war with Russia, then you make peace and agreements and negotiations and disarmament and the right of self-determination for people in provinces. Why is it okay for people in Czechia and Slovakia to decide they want to be two countries? But it's not okay for anybody in Ukraine to decide they want to be two countries. It shouldn't be up to Russia or Donald Trump or Zelensky to decree what the people in provinces in Ukraine should do. It should be up to the people in those provinces in Ukraine, and they should be able to decide they want to be partially independent or fully independent. That would be right or wrong, difficult or problematic. That would be democratic, and this is what they claim to be for, is democracy. And they're not. So, Trump is not going to end NATO, but we should. Is Trump going to end the United Nations? That depends on the rest of the world. If the United States leaves the United Nations, the rest of the world could more easily democratize it and make it something useful, or the rest of the world could pull out and declare, international law dead. That's up to the world. Obviously, the U.S. should stay in the United Nations, get rid of the veto, and democratize the thing, but should get out of NATO, which would eliminate NATO, which is in violation of the basic principles of the United Nations.
Yes, of course. Now, going back to the United States, because obviously, since you're there, you're in the eye of the storm. That what surprises me more is to see people who, just by this impulse of opposing Trump, also oppose peace. And I think it was a process. I mean, this party, the Democrat Party, that was supposed to be closer to a progressive agenda, advocating for peace, they somehow, and I want you to explain the process if you can, they somehow became more pro-war than the Republicans. I mean, what's going on with these people? You would expect them to be more rational and pro-peace and progress and everything else.
Well, there are some obvious structural reasons not to expect that. One is who pays for their election campaigns, the legalized bribery system, the so-called campaign contributions. Another is the corporate media that is hand in glove with the corrupt military-industrial complex, which determines the fate, in large part, of many politicians. So that there are structural difficulties that it's easier to ignore if you fantasize that the United States is a representative democracy. It just isn't. And so it's true that go back to 2005, and you had a significant movement for peace that was opposing wars in the United States as Republican things. And most of those people opposed those wars because they were Republican things, not because they were wars. And so when the Democrats escalated the wars so they could oppose them some more, so they could escalate them some more, so they could oppose them some more, and then took over the wars and made them democratic wars, well, then those people didn't oppose wars anymore. And yet those wars were shameful. And there was an Iraq syndrome along the lines of the Vietnam syndrome. You couldn't elect people like John Kerry or Hillary Clinton or even Joe Biden for years, but it wore off. It wore off gradually. People forgot, people bought the lies, people rehabilitated the war criminals, and you put somebody like Joe Biden in charge. Uh, and and Russiagate happened, so that Democrats believed that opposing the Republicans, which is, the primary goal of Democrats. Democrats don't stand for anything except not being Republicans. It meant you had to be the fiercest opponents of Russia too. And so the Democrats have always been more pro-war on Ukraine than the Republicans. I don't think people on the left are right to direct all their criticism to the Democrats, because the Republicans are monsters you can't even talk to, and the Democrats will listen to us. I mean, those lines have very much been blurred. I mean, they're all monsters who don't want to listen to you, and we have to go after all of them, including the Republicans. Let's remind people that the Republicans are almost all for the war on Ukraine, almost all for massive military increases, almost all for murdering every man, woman, and child in Gaza. And, because we do like to complain that the Democrats are these things, but the Republicans are these things too, and so we ought to stop letting the party story divide us and dominate our conversations. I mean, it really makes very little difference. The evil war machine is the people in Congress, the people in the State Department, the people in the Pentagon, and the people in the White House. It doesn't matter what their parties are. And the people who need to stop them are the rest of us. And meanwhile, we're divided by who thinks trans people should have rights and who wants to discriminate and persecute them, who thinks, women should be treated with decency and respect, and who wants to lock them in the kitchen. I mean, this is what people divide each other over. This uniparty is destroying the world.
I couldn't agree more. Now, the last question, because we are approaching the end of our discussion. USAID. Now, I have very mixed feelings. I don't believe for a second that everybody that worked for USAID is a representative of this evil, Soros-funded, corrupt institution, globalist institution. I don't think for a second. Why do I say that? Because I had the honor of being on a list that was put up by some people online with representatives of this globalist, decadent, Soros-funded, elite. Of course, I was not. And I was also put on a Putinist list, so I am among the very few that risks a double, attack from those who consider me, globalist, or for those who consider me Putinist. But in Romania now, it's a very heated debate, who got funded by the USAID. And I don't believe for a second that everybody that got financing through USAID is necessarily a bad person. At the same time, there is the other camp in Romania that is equally hysterical in the complete defense of USAID, saying that they are only financing programs that are alleviating poverty and they are involved in vital social work. And I heard some stories from Peru, I heard some stories from Afghanistan, the CIA infiltrating those USAID-funded programs. And I am torn in the sense that I think we should have a balanced perspective, because I don't think it's in black and white. What do you think?
It's amazing to me how simplistic and childish most people and most organizations insist on being on most issues, including this one. It's as if you can't have an agency with people doing good and bad in it at the same time. An agency of many thousands of operations. It's baffling to me. I've known good people for decades who worked in USAID and tried to do good and tried to be whistleblowers and believed they were doing far more good than ill. Programs that feed people, and people need to be fed. At the same time, to assert that USAID has never been part of trying to overthrow governments, including in Ukraine, has never been part of color revolutions, which themselves are not childish cartoons, but complex things with good and bad on the same side. It is just ridiculous to me. I know organizations that have been offered grants by USAID for very good, 100% good, noble things, and turned them down because they didn't want the association with USAID because of all the bad things it does. So it's always been very complicated. But to take, an agency that does good and bad and insist that it's all one or the other. That's every single news report I've seen on the defunding of USAID from around the world. Every single one. I've not seen one article that even mentions that there could be both good and bad in USAID. Not a single one in any media outlet. Please show me if I'm wrong. And it's the childishness is beyond that, because color revolutions and USAID pushed revolutions have talked about democracy and the use of nonviolence. You've got millions of peace activists around the world concluding that nonviolence and democracy are bad. These are the enemy. I mean, that's the extent of the childishness. We now have to go in and rehabilitate the idea of nonviolent activism, the notion of democratic self-governance, because they've been so poisoned by hypocrisy and their use for evil ends. There's an extreme need for the ability to think slightly complex thoughts, like we began with, a toxic nuclear ticking time bomb can be right twice a day, and usually is. I don't know how we overcome that, because politicians have mastered the appeal to those who want simplistic thoughts. And complex thoughts apparently are more odious than, starvation and environmental destruction and the threat of nuclear war. So, it's a tough job we've got ahead.
Definitely. But why on earth would Donald Trump want to defund USAID, since it is the invisible hand of the US government for toppling other, regimes that they don't like? I mean, is he so idiot that he thinks he's fighting Marxism, and at the same time he's throwing the CIA with the water, is doing that? Or is it something else? He wants a USAID that supports him, a more conservative one. Which one could be the explanation here?
Well, I have no power to tell you what Trump's thinking. I'm not sure Trump himself knows what he's thinking, and I continue to insist that we should spend less of our energy trying to figure out what Trump is thinking. But I do think the US is making no commitment whatsoever to respecting self-governance around the world. Donald Trump wants governments overthrown, including in Venezuela, including in Gaza. There are going to continue to be pressures for coups and overthrows and domination of policy by the US government. They may be more overt. They may be less subtle. Donald Trump is someone who has seen the use of these alphabet agencies to go after him and to smear him and to push an agenda he doesn't like in Ukraine. So who knows? But, we've got to stand up for the good and oppose the bad. We've got to insist on funding human needs and defunding political manipulation, even when they're within the same agency. It's not that hard. We do a lot more complicated things, just, getting dressed in the morning. There's no reason we can't do something that complicated other than political will. But what Donald Trump thinks or intends or what his long-term plan is, I don't think he knows. And so I don't think we should try to know.
Well, on that note, dear viewers, if you like what you saw, please like and share our content. We try to spread a complex message of peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Peace. Barricade.